Threat actors are leaning on new tools and techniques to improve the efficacy of their attacks. I'm Wyatt Cash with Scoop News Group, and joining us to talk about the changing threat landscape and the role of artificial intelligence and machine learning in cybersecurity is Derek Manky, Chief Security Strategist and Vice President, Global Threat Intelligence at Fortinet's FortiGuard Labs. Derek, thank you so much for joining us.
Wyatt, it's a pleasure to speak with you again. Thanks.
Well, I know the threat landscape is continually changing. How do you see that landscape changing notably over just the last 3 months?
A lot happens in 3 months, Wyatt, and it's changing quite significantly. In fact, we're almost seeing weekly changes happening. We're getting to that level, and to extrapolate a little bit on that in terms of what are the driving factors behind that, with three things in mind. One, we're seeing more speed. Speed is probably the number one factor that comes to mind. And what I mean by that is we often talk about there's more sophistication and more threats out there. Yes, we know that. But what we're seeing is that there's an agility piece here, portion to it, where threats from getting into a system and exfiltrating data or hitting the targets, demanding ransom, getting out of the system, that whole phase is happening much quicker now, including attackers capitalizing on new vulnerabilities as an example. And so that's one of the most concerning elements, is this theme of speed when it comes to the offense, right? The other thing that we're seeing is more aggression as well. And you can begin to imagine when you combine these together, you're getting an even more potent mix, right? So this is the problem. Yes, more speed, but more aggression as well. These are the double extortion, triple extortion themes, targeted attacks that we're seeing too. And then the tactics as well, the playbooks, right? So the ways, the methods that it's not just these, tried, tested, and true things that people are more or less aware of now, phishing campaigns, things like this. Much more tactical approaches, dual stage attacks that we're seeing after doing reconnaissance from information that's gleaned from social media networks, as an example. So those are our three driving factors that we're seeing. Yeah. In addition to obviously everything that we talked about before, yes, we're still seeing more volume. All of that translates to more risk.
And then maybe could you talk a little about some newer techniques that you're also seeing being used by cyber adversaries?
Yeah, so if we look at the actual TTPs as well, techniques, tactics, procedures, that playbook aspect, we actually have scope on this. So we're looking at real data at a much more granular level. So if you sort of think of the threats, yes, we have that 50,000 foot view, but we can really zoom into this, 5,000 foot view and look at all the different operating mechanics of the playbooks. And so defense evasion is the number one technique that we're seeing focused on right now, employed by attackers, which is significant, of course. We're a security vendor, so it's actually something we focus on quite closely as well, looking at how they're trying to evade security controls. What's the latest technique with that? And of course, there's a microscopic view. There's actually well over 50 different techniques associated with that, but generally defense evasion. And that's something that it's important, right? That you have a good response to that. And that's something we do as a security vendor. The other one is wiper malware too. So this is this ties into that theme of aggression, destructive malware that's wiping out usually hard drives, master boot records of systems. We're starting to see this also tied into that world of extortion too, right? So we're not just talking about data at risk, but systems infrastructure at risk now too. And finally, one of the most concerning to me new techniques is firmware, for direct firmware attacks. We refer to this as bricker attacks, bricker malware, bricker attacks. So it's not just, again, data or systems that can be re-imaged and restored, but literally turning devices and systems into paperwork. Like there's a much more rigid process that has to be taken. Obviously, things like RMAs, things like this, shipping that has to occur to restore these devices. And that's a very big concern. Thankfully, we haven't seen a lot of that yet, but we're starting to see some indications.
Sounds like a lot of serious assaults on a number of fronts there. Could you talk a little bit then about, so what can organizations do about these faster levels of attacks? Maybe talk about automation and how does AI and machine learning become even more critical for fighting threats today?
Yeah, so they're different, of course, and it's important to distinguish the difference, and they're both necessary. First of all, and I refer to this as the Osi model, for those familiar with networking protocols, where you have at the basic level and base automation that needs to exist. These are the things that are okay. We have a feed of threat intelligence coming into our system, and we're applying the policies for that. That's automation. That's absolutely necessary. Without that, we would be lost, quite frankly. I mean, we're responding to 100 billion threats a day with FortiGuard Labs, and a majority of that is automation. For automation, it's reactive also, right? It's reacting to what we know about the latest, greatest breaking threat. Where machine learning and AI comes into place are the things that are like the unknown unknowns we talk about, the 0 days, the things that are much tougher to predict or detect. How do you get ahead of the curve? That's part of ML and AI. So AI is the action piece. Machine learning is learning about this, perceiving what is a threat, having trust and confidence that this is a threat, and that we can actually put a policy in place to block that. Because just think of the benefits of that. Of course, some of these 0-day attacks, if you can do that with machine learning, and AI, which you can, you're again reducing that risk dramatically, any sort of costs that are associated with that attack too. The other piece of that, Wyatt, is, so that's the technology piece. The other piece of that is the skills gap conversation too, right? Machine learning and AI goes a long way to not replace but fill those gaps, right? Because we know there's a shortage in the workforce globally. Not just in cybersecurity, of course, but specifically in cybersecurity. How do you address that? Does it make sense to go and hire 20, 30 people in your NOC or SOC? And even if you have the OpEx to do that, can you find the people? And quite frankly, the answer is no in most cases. So again, this is where AI ML an integrated approach into security fabric is very powerful. And again, it stacks on top of that automation layer.
And then lastly, Derek, when CISOs talk about having a plan of action in place to address a threat and really, thinking about resiliency, what are some practical additional measures you might recommend today to reduce some of those risks?
Sure. So in my conversations with CISOs, this comes up every time is, Derek, I'm overwhelmed. There's a lot of attacks out there, a lot of information. How do we simplify this, right? So threat intelligence is the answer to this. How do you it's one thing to have a network security device. It's another thing to have NOC and SOC combined. Networking and security is converging, right? And that's where you have to have actionable threat intelligence, security subscription services tied into that. That's how you get to that automation level. Without that, you can't achieve that. So that's number one, to be able to detect and respond to that. But there's other, in addition to everything that we always talk about, that's a fundamental layer here. So employee education and security awareness training, patch management. We talk about that all the time. But in addition to that, segmenting networks is something that I recommend as a very effective practical approach to reduce risk, because again, a lot of these threats, yes, they can penetrate potentially one device or system, but if you segment it, it won't be able to spread, and won't be able to hit other systems, or won't be further downtime in those systems. I also, building on top of that, zero trust is a big thing nowadays, and ZTNA, zero trust network access. Again, there's a lot of things happening on networks, devices coming in and out, applications coming in and out. The idea of that is nothing should be trusted inherently. It should be earned trust. That goes a long way as well. And finally, breach and attack simulation. We don't talk about that a lot, but this is something I think, so breach and attack simulation, incident response, having a plan ahead of time is critical. Because as we say, it's not a matter of if, but when. There's going to be attackers knocking on your door. Yes, you want to do all that preparation work, but at the same time, have a game plan, right? And practice those in terms of breach and attack simulations, drills, and things like this too.
Absolutely. Well, Derek Manky, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to join us today and share some of your insights about the rapidly evolving threat landscape that organizations are facing and some ideas on kind of how to keep up with it. So we appreciate your joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.